Hi, everybody. This is the demo overview of our preliminary exercises for the texture project. So you're laying out your 18 by 24 drawing paper as we have been doing, dividing it into 12 sections, and those 12 sections are 4 inches by 5 inches. You're selecting 3 animals, one for each of your vertical columns. In the first box, you can either print out an image, or you could trace it, or you can hand draw it, but the first box should be an image of an animal with its normal texture in a normal setting. In the column or row directly beneath that, across from left to right, we'll be making variations of those animals as if they had textures that are not their natural ones. In the first row, we're making these textures that are man-made things. The row beneath that will be textures that are natural. And then in the very final row, you'll be taking the better of those two design ideas and playing around with it in terms of giving it a setting and thinking about color schemes. So I just wanted to run through a couple of examples with you. These are ones that I did that are, this one is obviously based on the concept of a rhinoceros, and I'm trying to achieve the feeling of kind of rough floor tiles. So this would be one of my man-made versions. Same thing's happening here. This fox figure has been rendered to have the feeling of the grain and the planks in between the wood of wood flooring. The fish here has been rendered to create the texture of kind of an industrial carpet. You see that I've done the carpet one twice. This was a texture that I thought worked a little bit better than some of the other textures I tried to put with the fish. So the first one is the just black and white carpet version, and the last one there is the one when I started to play around with the ideas of the background behind it, contrasting with the lines and shapes of the texture, as well as making a color scheme that would provide a contrast from subject to the background. Same thing's happening here. The rhinoceros, in this case, was being rendered in my natural version with the wing of a butterfly seen in extreme close-up, a macro view of the scales of butterflies' wings. Pretty amazing shapes. So I thought it would make an interesting texture. I thought that was more or less well achieved in the first version, but then I thought I could expand it even a little more. I tried to play with the idea of a monarch butterfly's color changes on its wings. So that's where those orange, yellow, and black line version came in at the bottom. I'm also trying really hard to make sure that the texture itself flows over the contours and cross contours of the subject. So in that bottom version, again, that's the one where I'm really expanding on trying to also play with the background setting and creating some contrast there. So you can see that I'm using a warm color primarily for my butterfly texture. So I wanted a cool color for the background. Most of the texture was done with curved shapes, so I wanted really straight lines in that setting. This one is an example of the fox that I was working with, and I thought that really the idea of turning the fur into feathers worked really pretty well in terms of fitting with being able to make the contours more obvious, making the texture flow over the body in a more successful way. And I liked what I was able to achieve with the texture in terms of just the black and white value changes. Adding a little bit of color to it in that second version there added a little bit of warm color. So I thought it would be interesting to try to contrast that with a cool background. But I was looking really at the wings and feathers of a crow. So I was thinking in my head of this as being a very dark valued, darker end of the value scale image. So I wanted the background to be really light as well. So we're playing a lot of contrast there. Overall, as you're working on these preliminary ones, remember you're taking that original idea, making one version of it with a texture that's a man-made item, another texture that's a natural item, and choosing between those two for a more formal version in which you also explore the setting and the color, will of course expand the best of those into the full formal design project. So remember, these can be kind of rough, they can be sketchy, you can use it as a way of trying out an idea that you don't completely realize as a finished work of art. This is one that I think I could expand on and create something that's more finished and more elaborate in a formal design. This is the fish design that I liked the concept of. The execution was maybe not as successful as I had hoped, but I wanted to create the feeling of a different type of leaf. In this case, I wanted a fern. So there's a bit of a spine running through the center of the fish, and the leaves of the fern are kind of curling to the opposite sides of that center line. Adding a little color helped a little bit with this one. The next versions included the elephant character or design, and I wanted to use something very industrial. I was thinking about those flooring plates that they use in industrial settings known as tread plates. Some of them are diamond, some are rectangular, and that created a texture I could work with pretty easily. With my alligator, I wanted to try the texture of rope. And so again, having a reference photograph to work from, or several reference photographs to work from, can really help guide you, but you want to think about the texture flowing over the contours of your subject so it's more believable in terms of 3 dimensions, more believable in terms of spatial relationship, and you also want to concentrate a lot on value. When you're working with texture, really the key to making it work is the same as the key to making any drawing really truly believable. You don't want just outlines. Outlines tend to flatten shapes. When you really start looking at what makes something feel dimensional and contoured, it really is the value, or what we might have called shading. That's what you're seeing here. The first version of the rope alligator evolved into my second variation there, in which I also started exploring the background and the color contrast. So I wanted a more warm-toned rope. It's obviously very curvaceous, very organic, so I set it in a very cold and angular setting, and that seemed to make sense. I tried with the pufferfish to use a man-made texture of woven burlap, so you can see the kind of over and under weave of the threads there. The elephant was really more successful, I thought, in this version, more so than the tread plate. I started working with the idea of the types of scales that you find on an iguana, and that one really was kind of fun to play with, so I expanded it for my color version. I wanted to play off the cool colors of the iguana and then to set it in a much warmer background. I also thought that the scales were somewhat geometric shapes, so I wanted a bit more organic curvature in my background. I tried the alligator in a fur texture, which was kind of a fun exercise to play with. Again, highlight and shadow is a really key thing to making your textures believable. Don't be afraid to try both additive and subtractive approaches as you're working on the textures. You can lay in lines, you can blend things, but you can also pull out highlights with your erasers, and that works really quite well. The pufferfish seemed to be more successful to me when I rendered it as leaves rather than as the burlap form. So I expanded the leaf idea a second time and also began playing with color there. So I wanted the leaves to be very green, much cooler, more natural looking. And then I thought it'd be kind of fun to play off those organic shapes with much more rigid, warm colored geometric forms in the background. So the roundness and organic nature of the leaves gets played off of these geometric forms. And I'm also really going for even more of a complementary contrast here of red versus green. The idea of trying to render the texture or appearance of metal is a good challenge. So with my wolf, I was able to achieve that in black and white and then expand again with color. Also here, I tried to make it appear a little bit closer to kind of a gold, maybe with a little bit of a hint of copper there. But again, the lines are very dominant in the texture of metal, so I wanted to really contrast some curves in the background. And again, to contrast my colors, remember we're looking here at a complementary contrast between yellow and purple. The brick brick texture is a fairly easy one to figure out. It's a little harder to make it flow over the contours, but in my rhinoceros without a horn, it's sort of hippopotamus-like. This creature definitely has some brick form in the second version that is trying to follow the contours of its body. Again, contrasting the warm color brick with a cool colored background. I worked with the rooster form here in trying to create the texture of something that was created by knitting. You can certainly see that beginning to work. The wolf was also attempted in a wood grain tone. I actually quite liked the wood grain. The thing I'm not crazy about here is that the wood grain comes off looking really flat. It doesn't flow over the surface of the body quite as much as I would have liked. The hippo-rhinoceros hybrid worked fairly well really in this grass texture as well. And again, I'm creating another variation on the background with more curved lines rather than straight and playing off the color contrast of the green versus the red. The last one that I worked with really was the texture for this rooster in an attempt to recreate various tree bark textures. I really quite liked how the tree bark was able to flow over the contours of the bird form, so I thought that was a more successful version than the earlier one, the knit version. And I also wanted to try to contrast that really, really rough texture of the bark with what was going on in the smoothness of the background. So remember, your preliminary exercises ultimately are an opportunity to play with 3 different animals in its original form, transforming it into the texture of a man-made item, then transforming it again into a texture that's more natural, but is definitely not the texture it originally would have, deciding between the two which one you think is better, and playing with that sense of contrasting in terms of color, and as well as the background setting, contrasting the lines and shapes of the original. We'll take the best of your final versions and decide from there to increase its complexity and to enlarge it to create a new, more complete version for our formal design project for texture. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of some options. It also should help you to think about having some source material to work from as a guide will really work. There are also several videos that I've linked in the coursework folder for this project that show you step by step how to do a variety of different textures, and I think that'll really help you get going. So try to be creative with this, try to have some fun with it. The end results from last school year in particular were really, really interesting, good design pieces. They looked like kind of surrealistic, artistic paintings by the time they were done, and it was a really kind of fun exercise for all of us. So I really look forward to seeing what you're able to create.